Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Dan Bruce, and I'm a Senior Manager in UHY Consulting's Transformation Solutions practice. And today I'm here to talk to you about strategic planning and how you can use strategic planning to drive growth and capture opportunities. So one of my responsibilities at the firm is I lead the strategy consulting service line. So as a strategy consultant, I've advised many clients on their strategic planning process. What I'm hoping I can do today is talk to you a little bit about the benefits of strategic planning, the value it can provide you with some strategies so you have a sample of strategies you can use through your strategic planning process, and then provide you with a high-level framework. So if you're not doing strategic planning today, it gives you a good place to start and figure out how to approach it. And before I get into the presentation, I wanted to just take a little bit of time, if you aren't familiar with UHY, to introduce you to the firm. So we are a top professional services firm, and we have very strong manufacturing expertise. So nationally, we have over 20 offices with over 1,000 professionals. And we've been serving our clients for over 50 years. But we don't just have a national presence, we actually have a very strong international presence as well. We're a top 20 professional services firm globally, with over 8,500 professionals in 100 countries. When it comes to our services, we have a very strong, comprehensive service list. It ranges everything from consulting, such as strategy consulting, to corporate finance and M&A, all the way down to due diligence, tax, audit assurance, and valuation. And on the manufacturing side, very strong manufacturing experience and expertise. So we have over 600 manufacturing clients, and those range across the board. So we work with some larger OEMs, as well as the tiered suppliers, all the way down to even down the tiered supply base to metal suppliers, plastic suppliers into that space as well. We have professionals who have worked out in the manufacturing space before, so they can bring their experience. And we have a large amount of access to industry data and subject matter experts. We provide a lot of thought leadership, so we do that through, we host an annual Manufacturing Outlook conference, as well as we have some monthly publication that we provide. And we're active participants in many manufacturing groups, such as the Jackson Area Manufacturing Association, as well as many others. So now that you have a little bit of background on UHY and our manufacturing expertise, let's jump back into the presentation. So strategic planning. Why should you prioritize this? What can it do? What's the value it can provide? And really, we find that companies that prioritize frequent strategic planning, they get a few benefits. So one is seizing growth opportunities. So by going through this process, maybe you find, hey, there's a market that I could enter that's growing, and go ahead and enter that market and achieve that growth. Also, increasing profitability. Well, maybe through your strategic planning process, there's some operational efficiencies you identify. You can lower the cost of some of your operations and improve the profitability. Creating competitive advantages. So in doing strategic planning, you do some research and analysis. Maybe you identify some trends in your industry or market that you can get on top of before your competitors. Maybe you identify, hey, what do our customers need? Are we providing those needs? Are our competitors providing those needs better than us? And how do we adjust so that we can create these competitive advantages? And finally, reacting quicker to disruptive trends. So the business world today is very complex, very fast-paced, and disruptive trends can come in and really disrupt your business or hurt your business. So you want to stay on top of those to make sure that you're prepared and that you have a plan of attack for them. And the strategic planning process can help you do that. So really, as you look at this, why prioritize strategic planning? It's really so you can be proactive and have some positive results and not just always be reactive to the planning process. So we talked a little bit about disruptive trends and how they can come in. I wanted to just show an example. This is an example of product technology innovation. So a particular product and a technology that was innovated over time. And usually this can happen, there's two types of technologies. You can have a sustaining technology. And what that is you improve an existing product's performance. And this typically happens frequently, so maybe annually, and it's just these incremental improvements that you see over time. Companies like these, usually it's a product you're familiar with, it's a high volume, highly profitable product, and you're able to easily kind of make these incremental sustainable technology tweaks over time and keep everything going. So for example, I threw this phone example on there. The phone started, you had the rotary dial, then you get rid of the rotary, you go to buttons, then you make it more compact, and eventually you lose the cord, and now you have cordless. But all of those are examples of incremental sustaining technologies. There's also disruptive technologies. So that's where a product is reinvented or it has a new value proposition. These occur much less frequently, and typically your product is going to be simpler and more convenient. It may not be as complex as that old sustaining technology. But we talked before in the sustaining technology, that's kind of your high volume, maybe highly profitable products. Usually when a disruptive technology comes in, there's not as big of a market for it. It may not be as profitable. And so companies tend to not want to look at these or invest too much time and effort into this. But you need to be aware of these and have a plan, because what will happen is eventually the disruptive technology may find a market and may take it over. And you can see here, I'm using the cell phone example. And if you weren't prepared and you weren't ready to move into that, it could very much disrupt your business or hurt your business. So you want to do strategic planning to be aware of these disruptive technologies and be prepared for them. And so the phone example is great, but we're talking manufacturing today, and this is just a sample of some of the current manufacturing trends that are out there. Some of them have been occurring for a while, some of them are relatively new. But these, as you're in the strategic planning process, are things to think about, especially in your research and analysis phase for, hey, what should we be aware of? What should we have on our radar? And so some like Industry 4.0, that's not necessarily new. We've been aware of that for a while. But things that are going on in that space. So you really have now this connectivity of sensors and data and humans communicating with the machines. And with 5G growing, that is creating faster speeds, lower latency. It's allowing more ability for connectivity between things and really increasing the pace of Industry 4.0. And so now you have, if you're in manufacturing, this Internet of Things concept, where in your manufacturing plant, you may have more sensors. You may be collecting more data. You have to analyze more of that data. Those are all trends you need to be aware of as you're going through your strategic planning process. There's also things like augmented reality. So now maybe there's a repair that needs to be done, and in the past you had to physically have someone on site to do that. Now with the augmented reality, maybe you have a person who's not on site, but who can walk someone who's still qualified enough to do the repair through that process. So it's not just the actual manufacturing process itself, it's also some of these it's ancillary services who need to be aware of these trends and what's going on. And on the augmented reality, that could apply to a quality control. It could apply to a complex assembly process. There's a lot of different ways that this could apply in the manufacturing space. So some other trends, we're seeing supply chain disruption. And a lot of this, was there, but it's been emphasized as we're kind of in the recovery phase of the COVID-19 pandemic shutdowns. But things like the chip shortages, the raw material shortages, all problems that manufacturers need to be aware of and take into account in strategic planning. Product, service, and innovation. So new material enhancements. So now we're seeing things, for example, if you're in the metals space, like advanced high-strength steels. Well, those require new equipment, new processes. They're handled differently. So you need to be able to think about that and be planning for that in your strategic planning process. Value-add services. So some manufacturers now are not just making the product, but moving up or downstream into, say, maybe now we make the product, but we also install it or we service it. And keeping those on your mind and seeing if your competitors are getting in that space is all part of that strategic planning process. The labor shortage. So we've had a labor shortage, but again, this is something else that's been now emphasized even further coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic recovery. But not just the skilled labor and the high turnover, Also, as we see with Industry 4.0, there's new positions that need to be filled. There's a lot more technology in the plant, there's a lot more data, and so those are shortages that need to be filled as well. And then things like back kind of with the supply chain disruption, but some reshoring. So, looking at reevaluating the supply chain, some of the executive orders that have been in place to look at the US's supply chain, and maybe dual sourcing certain items so you're not so locked in. So these are some of the things when talking manufacturing wise, when we start to talk about the framework of the strategic planning process, these are the trends you need to be aware of and need to identify how it impacts your manufacturing business and putting together a plan of attack for them. So before we get into the things like the framework, I wanted to pull some data together to show, hey, what are middle market manufacturers and family-owned businesses thinking of when it comes to the strategies they want to develop and do. And so UHY performs an annual middle market survey, and this is the results from last year on one of the questions. And this particular question is, in which ways are you preparing for post-pandemic road to recovery? And rank your top 3. So what strategies, what do you have in mind that you want to do as you come into this recovery process? And really, if I kind of summarize what the results show, there's 3 key areas. So people are thinking about operational efficiencies, so making their operations more efficient, cutting costs, increasing profitability that way. And they're also looking at market and product expansion. So this may be, hey, let's enter some new end markets. Let's diversify a bit. Let's lower our risk or our concentration in one space. Maybe that was hurt initially in the pandemic, and now they're understanding they need to diversify a bit. And then finally, technology improvements. So that is improving technology. We're seeing the Industry 4.0 trends, and then that technology improvement could also help with some of those operational efficiencies as well. So these are some of the things that are going through middle market leadership minds. And the other study, I took a look at, this one was from PwC, but this was on family businesses. And as I looked at what's on their minds as well, very similar themes. So you see the same themes of market and product expansion. So again, that diversification, lowering the concentration and the risk on one market or one product, and also the technology improvements. So, across the board, we're seeing very similar themes, and these seem to be where people are starting to place and companies are starting to place their strategies and start to look at what they would like to do in the future. And so, that's great. You see these strategies that are in place, what's kind of going through people's minds, but why isn't strategic planning occur? Or why aren't these strategies necessarily executed? What are the roadblocks to this process? And it's an interesting fact I found Harvard Business Review study did, that 85% of executive leadership teams actually spend less than 1 hour a month discussing strategy, and half actually spend no time at all. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me, especially as we talk, a lot of you on the line are middle market manufacturing companies, because there's kind of 2 reasons that I see this happening typically with clients. First is your organization is becoming more lean, and your leadership team already has a very expanded scope of responsibilities that they need to do to keep that business running. So this makes it very difficult to prioritize strategic planning. And also, typically a middle market company, you don't have a full strategy department. So you're doing a lot of these activities yourself, and you're so busy that it makes it very hard to prioritize and do this. The second big roadblock that I see is these are typically not simple, easy decisions. I mean, some examples of strategic decisions are entering a new end market, acquiring somebody, navigating these disruptive trends that have ability to really hurt the business. So all of these things are complex. They cause a lot of anxiety and stress, and it makes it very difficult, to complete this planning process. So I call these 2 items, you hear this all the time. What keeps you up at night? These are 2 items that I say keep you up at night. The top one is because if you are trying to do strategic planning, you're so busy with your daily responsibilities that you're typically doing this after hours and late. And the bottom item with the stress and anxiety of the decisions, This is when you're laying awake just trying to think, what do I do and how do I do it? And this is where, at UHY and strategy consulting, we come in and we help clients with this. We are able to help kind of take that off your plate and allow you to continue to do your daily responsibilities while pushing the strategy along and doing all the tasks that go with it, and providing frameworks and tool sets and skill sets that make these decisions easier and less complex. And so what I want to do now with the rest of the presentation today is first show you a sample of some strategies that you can take, and then provide some of that at a high level, the framework that we use, and maybe that can help you through this strategic planning process so that you can rest easier at night. So first, let's take a look at, here are some strategies, just a sample. As you're going through the strategic planning process, what's a strategy that could come out of it? And let's start at the top. So a market strategy. So maybe entering a new end market. Maybe diversification. We talked a bit about that earlier. That could be you're in one market today and you want to diversify and reduce the concentration and risk. Market expansion. So that could be, say you're an automotive supplier. You still supply automotive market, but maybe you do something else upstream or downstream within that market. A product strategy. So product innovation. Maybe you make a metal component today and you can determine a way to make that metal component out of a new material that's lighter, stronger. That would be an example of an innovation. Product expansion. So maybe that's you make a product today and you want to just expand on that product and make still for the same market, but make some different products there. And product consolidation, that is sometimes, look at these manufacturers and they have these very high SKU counts. And it might make sense to take a look at that and say, how much revenue are we making off all these and how profitable are they? Are we actually hurting ourselves, our time, our capital investment, our effort into this by having all of this? Should we remove some of these, and will that make us more profitable and allow us to focus on the areas that are growing more? Operation strategy. So you can expand your capabilities. Maybe that's new equipment, make process efficiencies, technology improvements, or take more data collection and analysis. Maybe you're looking to do a merger or acquisition. So in that case, you can buy more scale. Or if you're trying to enter a new market or enter a new product line, you can improve your position quickly. You go get those capabilities rather than taking the time to build them organically. A divestiture, so that might be selling to scale or, again, increasing your focus, getting rid of a piece of your business that maybe you're not as good at or isn't as profitable so you can focus on what is doing better. And then a JV or partnership that can increase scale, improve your market position, and allow you to share resources with someone else. So this is just a sample of strategies that you can use for growth and profitability and to think about as we now go talk about the framework for the strategic planning process. So this is the high-level strategic planning framework. And one thing I want to point out as you look at this is it's not a one-time event. So if you get the strategic planning framework process in place, it is something that you need to continuously do because trends are changing. You want to be able to stay on top of that. You need to make sure that the goals that you set are being achieved, or if they're not being achieved, figure out why, and make sure the goals that were set are still relevant and maybe you don't need to set new goals. So it's a continuous process, not a one-time event. If we take a look, really the strategic planning you can break down into 3 different segments, and we'll go into detail each of these segments. But first is the strategy reviews, which is either going to be, hey, if you've never done this process before, you need to set some things in place, your mission vision, your goals, take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of your company and also the opportunities and threats. If you have done that before, a review is just going to be to review that, see the progress you're making. Are they still relevant? Is there something else that needs to be added? The second step, strategic analysis. So this is going to be more of a research and analysis portion. So as you figure out maybe areas you need to look at, this is going to be doing research and analysis to dig into that further. And then finally, strategy development. So after you've done the analysis and you figure out, okay, here maybe is the new end market we want to enter because we found this one has high growth and meets our capabilities, the development is now putting together that implementation plan. So the initiatives, the tasks, the timeline, and who's going to do it. So that then finally you're out of the planning process and you're actually executing the strategy. So let's go one by one and look at a little more details of the activities that occur in each phase of this framework. So the first one in your strategy reviews. Like I said before, if you have never done one, you're going to be looking at these key activities and you're going to be doing them for the first time, kind of setting them. If you are in this process already, it's just going to be updating or refreshing what you've done before and making sure it's still relevant. So this is typically a meeting. It's going to be with the senior leadership team. And this is going to be to go through one, vision and mission. Looking at the vision, mission of the company, because these are critical. This aligns your internal and external stakeholders on what you want to achieve and how you plan to achieve it. And so internally, as all the employees come into the company every day, they need to clearly understand that vision to know what they're doing and why they're doing it. Short and long-term goals and objectives. So here, if you don't have these goals, you need to set them. And these need to be specific, measurable goals, and they need to align to the vision. Everything that you're doing as your company needs to align back to what your vision is. If you've already set these goals in place, what you're doing in this review session is just seeing how you're doing. What's the progress to these goals? Is there any new information you've learned where maybe you need to set new goals and reevaluating them? Competitive position. So this, a lot of times people see this in a SWOT analysis. You're really looking at your company's strengths and weaknesses. What are you doing well and not doing well? While also looking at the opportunities and threats externally. So that would be things like those disruptive trends we talked about. Then you're building strategic initiatives. So this is, all right, now that we know, here's our goals, here's our position, what are the strategies? What do we need to do to achieve those? And how are we going to attack it? Typically, this isn't done initially. If this is your first time, that's going to be done more in the strategic analysis or development phase. But if you've already gone through this and you're kind of just in your review cycle, you want to look at the strategic initiatives you identified previously and make sure that they still make sense. And also, finally, the last item with key performance indicators, you want to track your progress. So if you don't have a way to track your goals and your strategic initiatives, you're never going to know how well you're doing against them or if you're progressing. And so you need to make sure you have these in place so that you can see how you're doing and track the process. So the second step is the strategic analysis. So after you've looked at, say, your strengths and weaknesses, the competitive position, threats and opportunities, this turns into now the research and the data analysis needed to determine the best strategic approach. And this is really important. Using data to drive, hey, what strategy should we pursue? What market should we pursue? What product should we pursue? Is very important to the process because one, it helps align all your team members. You're going to have people who have different ideas, and using data to drive that decision is going to help align everybody. And also, it's going to help you avoid making a poor decision. So using a data-driven analysis versus just making the decisions without data is really going to help avoid some of those mistakes and costs and challenges that come with choosing the wrong strategy. So what might be a part of this? Well, you're going to do market and product analysis. You're going to analyze the market. What's the size? Is it growing? What are trends happening? This could be in your current market. It could also be if you're thinking of entering new markets, getting an idea of what those look like and what's the size, growth, and trends. In addition, looking at the customers. So in your market, what are your customers' current and future needs? If you're looking at new markets, well, what are the customers in those markets looking for both now and in the future? Same thing as you look at the competitors. You want to understand what are their current capabilities? What products do they have in the pipeline? Who are their key customers? You might in this phase do a product portfolio analysis. So this is, as we said earlier, you might want to take a look at all the products that you have today and make sure that you don't have too many SKUs in place and that you're not actually hurting yourself. So this graph actually off to the right, you can see is an example of a portfolio analysis where maybe you map out your products. And on the x-axis, you have revenue. So you can chart, is the revenue low if it's on the left or high if it's on the right, and align that with profitability. And you can start to see, okay, the products that fall into that top right category, those are your high revenue, high profitability. That's where you need to be prioritizing. And if products start to fall into the bottom left, that's your low revenue, low profitability, maybe those are some that you need to exit and focus your time, effort, energy, investment on those top products. Finally, a key activity, or the second to last, core competency and capability assessment. So this is where, both in your current market as well as maybe if you're looking to enter a new market, take a look at what are your current capabilities today. Do you have gaps in your current capabilities with the market you serve? And if you're looking at a new end market, look at your capabilities and what's needed to serve that new market. And what are the gaps? Is there anything missing? And finally, you can use all this data that you gathered together to then make a growth approach evaluation. So there's many ways you can grow. One, you can do this organically if you're looking to enter a new end market. You can do it yourself, or maybe you're going to go acquire somebody and then you're just going to enter it through that space. What's the best approach to do that? Well, now that you have all this data that you've gathered up in the earlier activities there, you can use that, synthesize it together, and figure out based on the capabilities that are needed and the potential of the markets that you're looking at, what's the best way to enter it. And that data allows you to make that decision and make a good decision. So the third step and the final one in the planning process is the strategy development. And this is where now, okay, you've identified what you need to look at, you've done the research and analysis behind it. That research and analysis has led you to a decision on the strategy you're going to take. Now you need to create an implementation plan for that strategic approach. So depending on this, doesn't matter what strategy is selected, there's some key activities that are going to take place here. So first, developing the strategic initiatives. So what are the strategic initiatives we need to attack this strategy? With each of those, you're going to want to put tasks to them with completion dates. So here's the tasks that we need to complete by this date to make this happen. You're also going to assign responsibilities so that someone has ownership over those tasks. And you want to then have KPIs so you can track how you're doing to that. So as you go into the execution, when you have all this planning in place, it allows you to track how you're doing and make sure that you're still on pace to complete the strategy and get it executed in time. So now we've looked at the framework of the strategic planning process. What are some of the benefits? And we talked about some of these already, but just to highlight them again. So you're creating a proactive strategy rather than reactive. If you're doing these review meetings where you're getting together with your leadership team and talking about the opportunities and threats, and then you're researching what's out there, both in your market or a new product, that's all very proactive. And in order to do those things like seize the growth opportunities, increase profitability, create advantages, you want to be more on the proactive side rather than on the reactive side. This strategic planning is going to incorporate data in your decision-making process. So this is going to avoid the costs and challenges that can result from the poor decisions that come from non-data-driven decisions. It helps you prioritize efforts and allocate resources effectively. So as you're building that in the last third step, the development, you're building that implementation plan. You can start to align who should be doing it, when they should be doing it, and that's going to help prioritize the efforts and allocate your team. And finally, this is creating a forward-focused roadmap that's aligning all the stakeholders at all levels of the company. So you want to make sure as you come up with these strategic initiatives and goals that you broadcast that to the company, because everybody who's working there wants to understand, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why are we striving to do it? And if you do that, you're going to increase the accountability in your organization. And you can see there's a couple stats there at the bottom that talk about, this Harvard Business Review study revealed on average 95% of a company's employees don't understand the strategy. And you see a lot of times businesses fail to meet their targets. And I think there's some linkage there. And so having all your employees aligned with, hey, here's our vision and here's the strategy that we're looking to achieve, helps build that sense of unity and working toward the same goal. And so in this process, a question that I get asked a lot is, who should participate in the strategic planning process? And it's ultimately going to be the decision of the leadership team, but you can involve other people outside of that team. So leadership team is key, maybe some other key stakeholders. So if one of your strategic initiatives is to grow a certain area of the business, maybe you pull in a manager of that area or someone who's going to have a lot of responsibility for helping grow that. They should probably be involved in that strategic planning process at that time. An outside advisor. So I do strategy consulting. I have done this and advised many different companies and clients. So I have a lot of experience and can help make this process more efficient. Using an outside advisor who can make the process more efficient, who can bring a fresh perspective and thought process, can be very useful and helpful. And also kind of free up some of your time so that you can keep doing your daily responsibilities and let them kind of make the process more efficient and help you through it. And sometimes, board of directors could be involved as well. Typically, they're more going to just kind of approve the strategies that come in place, but sometimes, depending on their expertise, they may be involved in the planning process as well. And really, involving more than just, say, a single person or two people in the planning process is very important because it helps eliminate some of the bias. So some examples of bias are on the right here that can come into play. So if you're just looking at this yourself, you may have a recency bias where you heard about something very recently and that's now what's stuck in your head and that's the route you want to take. There's also inertia bias. So that could be, hey, we've done similar things in the past. It has worked. So I'm going to pick this strategy because it's similar and familiar to me. It might be the right one, it might not. That's where using a broader audience and data can help determine that. And finally, confirmation bias. Someone may already have an idea in their head of this is the strategy you want to take. And then you start to only look at data and facts and viewpoints that align with that particular item. So diversifying the team, including some more people in this process, really helps to avoid that bias and come up with a better strategic plan. All right, so the next thing I wanted to do, now that we've gone through strategies and a framework, is I wanted to bring up a case study and show how this can apply in the real world. In this particular case study, and we have a lot of manufacturers on the call who are in the automotive space, so this is an automotive case study, but even if you're not in the automotive space, I still think you'll be able to relate to this case study, and there'll be some takeaways that you can use going forward. So let's talk, we saw the disruptive trend and we saw the phone example earlier. Let's take a look at a historical transportation example. And some people may have seen this before, but I do just think this is a fascinating story and how it relates to what we're seeing today. So the image on the left, 1900, this is Easter Day, New York City. It's a parade on Fifth Avenue. And you can see in that street, you have a horse and buggy is the primary form of transportation. I think there's one motor vehicle you can point out. Now you fast forward 13 years ahead to year 1913. Easter Day parade again, Fifth Avenue, same street, and you take a look at it now, and it's all motor vehicles. In fact, I think there's one horse and buggy that you can call out there. So that is a very fast, very quick transformation that occurred in the automotive space. And it's not just the mode of transportation. This is what you need to think about as you're doing your strategic planning. Just because a trend is occurring in automotive, what are some of the other effects that are happening? And so I have that table on the right that shows additional changes. So mode of transportation, yes, that changed. You went from horse and buggy to motor vehicle. But what about things like even fuel source? I mean, back in 1900, you're feeding the horses. You have the troughs, food and water. Well, now all of a sudden, if I'm a supplier of that, sure, there's still horses, but maybe not as many and maybe not in the same locations. Now gasoline might be what's fueling these vehicles. Take a look at the roads. I mean, you had dirt roads. 13 years later, now you're looking more at pavement. The materials that are being used. So your horse and buggy, primarily wood. Well, now all of a sudden, if I have wood and I'm selling it to the horse and buggies and there's less of those, using metal, rubber, and glass on these vehicles, it's a complete disruption. And even down into some of the components. So maybe the lighting in 1900, you were using candles. Now you're starting to get into more electric headlights. So it's a very disruptive change, and it impacts more than just one area, not just the mode of transportation, but the ecosystem around it. And so how does this apply today? Let's take a look at electric vehicles. You have this electric vehicle technology that's creeping in. It's already there, but we're seeing this large adoption that's supposed to occur over the next 10 years. I think of it a little bit similar to our horse and buggy to motor vehicle transportation example. And if we look at what's occurring, I like to use this graph that's below. So it's the technology adoption S-curve. So on your y-axis, you have market share. So that's the percentage of the market that's using a technology. In this case, it would be an electric vehicle. And on the x-axis, you have types of consumers. So all the way to the left, that's innovators. So that's going to be your consumer who just is into the newest thing. Price doesn't really matter. They just want to get the latest, greatest. The next one, early adopters, care a little bit more about price, want the technology to be a little more established before they buy it, but still willing to take a little bit of risk. And then you eventually enter into your majority. So that's the masses. And then finally, you have your laggards. So that's going to be people who kind of just forced into it. Maybe there isn't the old technology they were using before isn't even available. But if you look at where we are, so in 2020, we're just creeping into that early adopter phase. But by 2030, when you look at the projections of where electric vehicles are supposed to be, now we're in majority. And so if you are, put yourself in an automotive supplier's shoes. If you don't start to do strategic planning and execute a strategy before you start to get to that majority curve portion of the curve, you are behind. And that's where, if you're an automotive supplier today and you look at this, you should have already been starting to do some strategic planning. But if you have not, now is the time, because you're very close to the brink of that becoming a problem. And so if you're not an auto supplier, you are an auto supplier. Let's take a step back and let's think about, with this occurring, how could you use strategic planning? What could you have done to kind of foresee this coming and plan for it better? And so you start to have your reviews maybe 5 years ago, and maybe you already had goals in place, but you're looking at your opportunities and threats, and you see this coming. And so the next step would be, well, let's do the strategic analysis. Let's start to do some research and analysis into what's happening. And if you did that, you might find things like this. So maybe you start to look at your production volume by powertrain type, and you would start to identify, wow, so right now, yeah, we're at about, with hybrids and battery electric vehicles, we're just under 10%, but we're starting to reach, in 10 years, it's going to be at about 40% of the production. That's a red flag. That's a trend that you need to take seriously. On top of that, you're seeing, hey, the automotive OEMs, they're announcing huge investment, over $200 billion of investment in EVs. So there's a second trigger to say, disruptive trend. Need to start planning for that now. The other thing you might find in that research and analysis phase is, why is this occurring? Why all of a sudden are we seeing this massive explosion and incremental production of these vehicles? Well, you probably find two major things. One, government regulations are pushing it that way. But two, as this graph shows, there's been some major technology improvements. One of them being the cost of batteries. So you look at this graph, and if you were doing the research and analysis and tracking this over time, you'd see back in 2010, so the blue, I should call out the blue line shows this is the EV battery pack cost in dollars per kilowatt hour over time. And what the orange line is that is where it meets ICE, so internal combustion engine price parity. So essentially, when you get to the point where the battery electric vehicle and the gas-powered, the internal combustion engine vehicle are the same cost. And you can see there's been this huge improvement in the cost. And today we're just above that $100 per kilowatt hour. Some OEMs, maybe Tesla's, might already be at the price parity, but you're really looking at that hitting mass adoption in 2024. So not far away, where now cost is not as much of an issue when it comes to an ICE vehicle versus a battery vehicle. And this is something you could capture through your research and analysis or the strategic analysis phase. What about charging infrastructure? So for a while, you may have not taken it serious because you heard, oh, people have range anxiety. The batteries don't last very long. Or if they do have to charge, there's no chargers around and it takes too long to charge. Well, if you're doing this strategic analysis, you would start to see, okay, public charging stations are growing. You can see on the map that it's starting to have more coverage, as well as you see in that table, here's the growth that we're seeing. The batteries themselves, when we talk range anxiety, are starting to get into the 300-mile or more range. So now that's a long way these vehicles can go, and that's reducing some of the range anxiety. And on the charger side, you're starting to see the DC fast chargers. So yes, it's not as fast as filling up your gas tank, but it's improving the speed of filling it up. And also you can charge at home. There's some different behaviors that are going to occur with electric vehicles rather than ICE powered vehicles. So all of this you could identify and start to know you need to build it into your strategic plan. So through that research and analysis phase, you'd start to identify these trends, you'd see what's coming, what's the growth, and then you may have to ask yourself, okay, but as an auto supplier, depending what you do, does this impact me? How do these impact me? And you then learn that the answer is electrification really impacts every vehicle subsystem. So I think we hear about powertrain and drivetrain all the time, but that's where if you're going from a traditional ICE vehicle to a pure battery vehicle, you completely lose the engine, the transmission, fuel tank, exhaust, all of these go away. They're replaced by new products like the battery pack, electric motor, inverter, converters. And so if you're in that space and you're making components for those powertrain and drivetrain, ICEs, you need to start making a plan either to expand into other products or start looking at how you can get into these battery electric components because they're going away. Still well known, but maybe less known is the chassis. So your traditional chassis, you have all these different complex platforms that vehicles are built on. And you can see in that picture, it's usually, there is some commonality, but usually different for each one. Well, now in the battery electric vehicles, you're going to a skateboard chassis. So it's really much simpler. You're going to have one platform that multiple different vehicle models can use. And that's a big change if you're making these traditional chassis components. And what about the interior? You look at that top image and you see interiors of, recent, you have a lot of buttons, a lot of knobs. You do have a touch screen, but you still have all these controls. And you're starting to see in the electric vehicles, because there's so much more electronic components, kind of getting this cleaner look. It's primarily touch screen. There may not even be an instrument panel up top. And so it's a very, very, very different look and feel. So now what you've done in your strategic planning process is seen the trends coming, identified it is going to impact me, and realize, okay, we need to come up with strategies to account for this. And we've seen the OEMs and tier ones do this. So this is some examples of the strategies that they've decided to take as they've seen this coming. So one, an example of a joint venture or partnership. Ford and Volkswagen formed a JV an alliance because they want to share the Modular Electric Toolkit, or MEB EV platform. So that's the platform that Volkswagen was working on, kind of that skateboard platform. And the advantage to this, so they can share resources together, they can get the technology to scale and really improve both of their market positions as this technology grows very quickly. What about on the acquisition side? Well, Dana, who traditionally was a powertrain component manufacturer of the ICE vehicles, saw this trend coming and realized, we need to quickly gain access to some of this technology. So they acquired a company, TM4. And TM4 made electric motors, power inverters, control systems. And what this allowed them to do was very quickly gain access to control the new technologies and capabilities. About a divestiture strategy. So American Axle, they sold their casting operation. They basically said, we see these trends coming, the engine transmission casting blocks start to go away. So let's refocus our efforts and let's divest that business somewhere else. So that allowed them, yes, to refocus. They could invest capital into higher priority products and services as they started to move more into the electric vehicle components. On the market entry or expansion, so this is out of even just kind of the pure auto supplier, we're now getting into a metal, a steel maker with Big River Steel. So they saw this electrical steels trend coming. So the electric vehicles, they need electrical steels for their motors. And so they added this big expansion, a $1.2 billion expansion, so they could make these electrical steels that they knew were going to be needed in these vehicles. So they're increasing their capabilities to diversify their offerings and also grow because they see the growth and the need for this steel. Finally, product service commercialization. So we talked about chargers. Well, then you see companies like Plugless who are saying, now, what if you didn't have to plug in your charger? What if there was an inductive charging potential where you just drive over something and it charges your car? And so they went on the innovative route and commercialized, the first to market application for this wireless EV inductive charging. So they're differentiating themselves in the market and increasing growth. So all of those are great examples, but that's looking at the very high. We're talking OEMs, tier one suppliers. But what about the tiered supply base, right? Now, I know a lot of people on the call are not OEM or tier one. Well, this impacts you as well. And we can take a look at, if you're a smaller manufacturer, in the middle market for the manufacturing, how you could look at this and use strategic planning for a plan of attack. So let's pretend you're a metal stamper or caster, and you're producing components on an ICE today in the powertrain. So we talked about this earlier. Maybe you're making internal combustion engine components or transmission components. And all of those, as we go to electric vehicles, are going away. So you have your strategic reviews, you identify this, you start to do your strategic analysis to figure out, okay, what else can we do? What's the strategy we should take? And how do we execute it? So in your analysis and your reviews, you come up with some options. So there are some new opportunities and technologies that you identify, and you do this through your strategic planning process. So metal stamping. So yes, there still are stamped parts in the electric vehicle and some of those powertrain components. So they're different components, but they still require stamped parts. So there is the opportunity to maybe just transition into some of those parts. But there are other opportunities and technologies that you could look at as well. So maybe you're going to need some new materials that you have to work with. The advanced high-strength steels, the high-strength aluminum, the electrical steels. These may be areas you need to get involved in if you're going to transition parts. Maybe you stay in automotive, but you do some non-powertrain parts. So you go into different components. Maybe you get into those electrical steels like we saw. That's going to grow, and people are going to need those to be manufactured. Maybe you transition into rather than an engine, but battery enclosures or the casting and the housings. Maybe there's something else you can do there. On the casting side, if you're a caster, well, we saw those large cast engine blocks, those large cast transmission blocks, they're eliminated. So you may have to look at, all right, are there other non-powertrain components I can get into? Or do I start to look at another market? Maybe I use my casting capabilities in something non-automotive related. So these are the thoughts that get generated in the review. You now need to go, you do your strategic analysis and research to look at it. And for example's sake, let's go down the path of you now identify, hey, let's expand our products. Let's stay in automotive. Let's keep doing metal stamping and casting. But what's a product expansion that we can do? And what you do is you, through your research and analysis, identify, hey, in the skateboard chassis that we talked about earlier, the skateboard platform, there are some components that we believe with our capabilities, our skill sets, relationships, maybe we could transition into this. And so we talked about the skateboard a little bit before, but really, what this is, it's a less complex design, a simple design, And really, you're going to start to put different top hats on top of this. So, if you could transition and get some of and start making components for a platform, that would be a good way to get into the EV space. And so what might that look like? So now this is where your strategic analysis phase really gets important. So you start to look at, all right, what's the equipment that's required for these types of components? What if I have a press, what tonnage do I need? What type of secondary processing do I need? Cutting, bending, extrusion. And can we do that today? Or is that something, if we're going to want to get into these components, that maybe we need to acquire or start to develop organically? What about the materials, doing research on the materials? It's primarily steel and aluminum. Can we work with those products? What about the high strength steels? Do we have the ability to do that? Or is there some other piece of equipment or process that we need to get familiar with? On the processing side, so are we able to work with the processes that are being used here? Do we have the forming capabilities? Do we have the welding capabilities? And so through the strategic analysis phase, you start to get all of that information together, as well as look at maybe what specific components you can work on. So some of these are very large, some of these are smaller, depending again on your press size and your capabilities. Start to figure out what makes sense as far as our plan of attack. And finally, in that bottom, left-hand corner, that's, who should you be talking to? So as you start to do research and see, what are some of the bigger tier ones or tier twos that are making these components? Do we already have relationships with them? If you don't, maybe do you start forming relationships with these companies? And that way, that can help you ease into producing this product or expanding this product in that space. And so hopefully what that, automotive or not, you can kind of see how, given this electrification, big disruptive change that's coming, how you could have used strategic planning to, one, identify it, come up with it as an opportunity and a threat, start to do strategic analysis and research to figure out, all right, how is this impacting my company? What can I do? What strategy can I perform, like a product expansion strategy to take this? Then put together an implementation plan. Hey, here's the equipment we need, the materials, the relationships that we need to come up with to make that happen. And so I'll finish there. Want to again thank everybody for joining today. If you have any questions, there is the ability, look there to ask questions on here. So I'll give everyone a second if you want to ask a question on the form. But if you have any questions outside of this, about anything I talked about today, or maybe you just want to brainstorm, hey, we've done some strategic planning in the past, but I don't like the direction we've taken, or maybe you've never done strategic planning before, and you just want to know how to help get started. I have my contact information up on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me and talk. Be happy to answer any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at some of the questions here that were asked and answer them. All right, so we do have one. So one is, all right, it's difficult in the strategic planning process to figure out whether to take an organic approach or an M&A approach. How do you typically decide what's best? So that's a good question. We get that question a lot. It's, hey, we know we want to enter into this new end market, but we don't know what's the best way to do it. And that's where, doing the strategy consulting, we have a lot of processes and tool sets in place to help make that decision easier. But what you basically want to do is, in your research and analysis, you're going to gather data on a couple things that are going to help you make that decision. First, as you're looking at different markets that you want to enter, you want to figure out which ones have the highest potential. So you're going to gather data on the size of that market, the growth in the market, the trends, maybe customer and competitor fragmentation, maybe what relationships are needed to be in there. All of that data is going to come together, and you can basically put together and figuring out which markets have higher or lower potential than others. The second piece of data you want to gather to help you make that decision is the capability alignment. So as you're looking at these different markets that maybe you're looking to try to enter, you need to identify what capabilities are needed in that market. And this is really the key to the organic versus M&A decision. As you look at those capabilities and you look at your own capabilities, you can then assess your gaps. If there is a market that's high potential and you have the capabilities, it might make sense then to attack it organically. Go ahead and start to build it organically. If there's a market that has very high potential, but you don't have a lot of capabilities, maybe the better approach there is to do an acquisition so that you can get those quickly. It may take too long and maybe too difficult to build up all those capabilities and skill sets in the time you need. So that's just kind of high level, the data you would take a look at and what you would really use to kind of focus that decision to determine, do I want to do this organically or through an acquisition? All right, let's take a look. We do have one other question here. So the second question is, how long does this typically take? Like if an advisor, if UHY comes in to do this strategic planning process, how long does that typically take? Well, it's going to depend. So it's going to depend on, is this a strategy you're looking at for an entire company? Is this for a particular business unit? Is this for a particular project? So that's going to be one thing that impacts it. But I would say typically on average, what you're going to look at is that first phase, the strategic review process. That's going to be more of a 1 to 2 day workshop type session, a facilitated session where you're getting together and doing a lot of brainstorming and looking at how the progress. The strategic analysis phase, so that's going to take a bit longer just because there's a lot of research involved, a lot of data analysis. So depending on what you're looking at, if it's just your own market or you want to look at 3 or 4 other markets that maybe you're looking to enter, that could be anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks worth of effort where it's a very collaborative process. So you're constantly meeting weekly to kind of look at progress. Here's what we're learning about your market or the other markets that we've been researching. But the advisor typically takes that and does all the research off on the side so that you can keep continuing to do your daily work and tasks throughout the day. And finally, the development process. So that might be another week or 2 to put that plan together. So really, you're looking at maybe all in a month or so, a month and a half to kind of complete one of these strategic planning processes. And after you go through that and have a good framework in place, it makes the repeat processes earlier. So it may not take as long as you do as you go through the process again. But that's the typical time frame, I would say, for a project and a strategic planning process like that. All right, so we're running up on time and I don't see any other additional questions. So again, just want to thank everybody for attending, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on this presentation or want to talk about any strategic planning questions that you have. Thank you, and I look forward to working with some of you soon.